Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I just have a few housekeeping items to go over before we get started. Just want to let you know the restrooms are out that hallway, the back hallway. You can feel free to use those whenever you want. We have some programs on the table over there of some upcoming adult programs, as well as some evaluation forms you could fill out if you have time at the end. Let us know what other programs you'd like us to do. That's a helpful way for us to plan future events. So this program goes till we close at 7. You'll have to exit through the back hallways, through those back double doors. And now I will introduce our presenter, Jeremy Dimmick. He is the Director of Collections at the Detroit Historical Society, and he will tell you all about the history of the Lions. So I'll turn things over to him.
Okay, I think I got that on. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. I appreciate everybody coming out. After what happened with the Lions recently, I gave this talk up at Saginaw Valley University the Tuesday after the Lions lost. And I walked in the door and our contact there said, oh, we had you in our auditorium, but so many people canceled, we had to move you to our small classroom. And so there's still, 20, 30 people there. But yeah, I guess, the interest, some of the interest waned, I guess, after this most recent loss. But we won't let that kind of dampen our spirit. The nice thing about this presentation is it's kind of evergreen. We spend most of our time in the 1930s. We jump up to the 50s, and then we'll bring it current by the end here and get into a little bit of what happened these past couple seasons. But yeah, my name's Jeremy Dimmick. I'm the Director of Collections and Curatorial at the Detroit Historical Society. So essentially my job is we take care of the artifacts in the cases and the words on the wall at the Detroit Historical Museum and the Dawson Great Lakes Museum. Here's the title of our talk today, The Detroit Lions in the Early NFL. That is the very first Detroit Lions team, 1934, on the screen there. You're going to get to know these guys pretty well by the time it is all over with. If you haven't been to either of our buildings in a little while, I wanted to take just a second at the beginning of the presentation to tell you a bit about our organization. Quick commercial here, we'll get it out of the way, get it over with, and then get into the Lions. That building on the right is the Detroit Historical Museum. It was built on Detroit's 250th birthday, July 24th, 1951. It opened to the public. And it was renovated in 2012, but the building is pretty different now than it was when it opened. One thing is exactly the same, and that's the streets of Old Detroit down in the lower level. And if you happen to visit as a kid, that's likely the thing you remember. It's just dark and scary enough where it sticks in your mind if you visited a long time ago. While we renovated in 2012 at the Detroit Historical Museum, we did 19 temporary and kind of short-term exhibits over the last calendar year. So we always try to make sure there's everybody sees a little bit of themselves, a little bit of their family story represented on the wall when they come through our building. And those are a lot of fun and let us get into a lot of different topics. The building on the left is the Dawson Great Lakes Museum. We also operate that museum out on Belle Isle that is specifically focused on maritime history. That one opened in 1961 and again was renovated in 2012, and we do changing, rotating exhibits out there as well. So it's always different when you come back. So with those things kind of out of the way, we will jump forward. One of those temporary exhibits we did at the Detroit Historical Museum will likely be of interest to you if you came out for this talk. It's an exhibit called Gridiron Heroes. It covers the entire existence of the Lions from their first season in 1934 all the way up through the 2023 season. It opened in August of this past year, and it uses artifacts from our own collection, from the Detroit Lions team collection, and also objects from the Pro Football Hall of Fame. So it's a really, really great collection of Lions stuff. If you're interested in Lions history, I would highly recommend this exhibit. On the screen here is a practice sweater from 1934, and then there's a helmet that belonged to Dutch Clark, kind of the Lions star player. People called him the Ty Cobb of football in the 1930s, which gives you an idea of how well respected he was. But with that, commercial over, we'll get into what we're here to talk about today. So different from the exhibition at the museum that covers the whole history of the team, this talk kind of focuses in on the 1930s. So why? Why focus on the 1930s? And The first and foremost reason is that it's a lot of fun to talk about this team in the 30s. They are kind of the gold standard of the league in the 30s and then again in the 50s, which we'll talk about too. It's actually, well, it's fun and interesting to talk about. It's a really critical time for the Lions themselves. Professional football hadn't really caught on in a really significant way in the 30s. And so a lot of the things the Lions are doing are really emblematic of where the league is at that point and kind of where the sport of football generally is. They make a lot of decisions in this first year, 1934, that we're going to focus on that are still with us today. They pick the team name, they pick the team colors. A lot of the traditions they start in the 30s are still here today. So we'll see kind of the roots of all of that by talking about the 30s. Finally, you don't hear a lot about football in the 30s. You hear a lot about the history of baseball. And particularly in my line of work, you can't turn around without running into somebody who's a baseball historian. But there are relatively few football historians out there. And I think that is because there isn't a lot of connective tissue from the game now in 2025 to the game 92 seasons ago in the 1930s. None of the teams play in the same buildings. The game itself is played in a completely different way. I'll show you a bit about the Lions offense and defense this first season. And, if you know a bit about the history of football, it might look familiar, but when you flip on the Super Bowl this weekend, the offense and defense you see is going to look nothing like the one you'll see here. So there isn't, that connective tissue. All the records aren't maintained. Baseball has a much better sense kind of its own history. Football really doesn't. But there's some really interesting stories, some really great characters, and some cool things going on in the 30s. So hopefully this program will start to cure that ill. So before the Lions caught on in Detroit, professional football was a unmitigated flop in the city before them. So there was a long-standing tradition of amateur and college football in Detroit. The earliest team we know of was at the Detroit Athletic Club. They played their first season in 1888. We think that's the first kind of organized football season in the city. But by the 1920s, this organization called the American Professional Football Association comes online. And they perhaps wisely changed their name to the NFL 2 years later. That rolls off the tongue a little bit better than the APFA does. But Detroit actually had an entry into that first season of the NFL in 1920, or this NFL predecessor. They were this outfit called the Detroit Heralds. And they sound like a professional team, kind of on the surface. They played at Meabon Field. They were in this first season of the NFL, but they were in actuality kind of a Mickey Mouse organization. And we know that because you see in the newspaper, they held their tryouts for that 1920 season on October 8th, 1920, and they had their first game on October 15th, 1920. So they were trying out a week before they had to be on the field playing their first game. Perhaps it's no surprise that they only win 3 games over 2 seasons. They actually changed their name to Detroit Tigers in 1921, which this is going to come up again in just a second. They make kind of a critical mistake in that they choose to play in Meabon Field. That's on the screen right here. Meabon Field would become Briggs Stadium, would become Tiger Stadium. And while that's a good move kind of for prestige, they're playing in the same building as Detroit's baseball team, so it has a kind of cachet that goes with it. They can't draw nearly as well as the Tigers. They are only drawing about 3, 4, 5,000 people at best, and essentially they can't make their rent. Meabon Field's really expensive, and if you're not drawing anybody to the stadium, you can't pay your rent. So they go belly up after the 1921 season. There's no team again in 22, 23, 24. And then in 1925, this organization called the Detroit Panthers comes online. And they are owned, coached, and quarterbacked by the same guy, this guy named Jimmy Conzelman. They were pretty good. They win 12 games in 1925. They're okay in 1926. But they also choose to play at Meabon Field. And even though they're good, they are not drawing nearly as well as they have to. And so they go belly up as well after the 1926 season. There's no team again in 1927. In 1928, we get this team called the Detroit Wolverines. And if that name and color scheme sound familiar, it is because they wanted that name and color scheme to be familiar. Um, they were they went as far as to draft this guy Benny Friedman, who was U of M's quarterback, and they brought him in, changed the team colors, made them maize and blue, just to try and again borrow a little bit of legitimacy from the college game. At this point, too, football is a distant second as far as professional sports go. Baseball is far and away the most popular professional sport, but football isn't even the most popular. I should say, pro football isn't even the most popular football sport. College football is by far more popular than the pros in the 1920s. And so you see the pros try to imitate college in this way that doesn't really happen anymore. And this is a good example of that. They are actually pretty good too, but again, just nobody cares. Nobody's coming to these games, and they fold after one season. They actually play at University of Detroit Stadium, which is much, much smarter because the capacity is far lower. It's only 25,000 people, where Navin Field is up to about 45,000 people by this point. So there's no team again in 1929, but that year is very important to our story because this team comes online. This is the Portsmouth, Ohio Spartans in 1929. They joined the NFL the next year in 1930, and they really hit the ground running. They win 11 games in 1931, and in 1932, they tied the Chicago Bears for the best record in the NFL. So this is a bit of a side note. This story is a bit of a tangent, but it's really interesting. So Portsmouth and Chicago tie in that season. They both have 11 wins. And so normally what would happen is whoever had the most wins in the NFL, congratulations, you're the champion. There's no playoff system. There's no championship game. There's no nothing. If you had the most wins, you were the champion. So when Portsmouth and Chicago tied, normally they just would have gone to a tiebreaker, which was, well, how did you do when you played head to head? And the only problem with that is that Portsmouth and Chicago tied in the only game that they had played head to head. And so the NFL was like, well, we don't really know what to do. I guess play again. And so they called it a replay game. And it was actually set to be played at Wrigley Field, which is where the Bears played their home games. But because of this huge winter storm the night before, it was decided to move it indoors to Chicago Stadium, where the Blackhawks and later the Chicago Bulls would play. And because a hockey arena is smaller than a football field, they played on an 80-yard field. No kicking was allowed. You couldn't kick field goals or drop kick, no extra points. All you could do was run and pass. And there was dirt down on the arena floor from a circus that had been there a couple days before. And so they just left the dirt down there, put some chalk lines on, and away they went. They played the game. It's this really wild story, but it amounts to the first NFL playoff game, the first NFL championship game, and Detroit is tangentially involved in it. But it's really interesting. If you want to look up more about this game, there's great oral histories from players who played in this game. Just a wild, wild thing. Unfortunately, Chicago won and won the championship. But despite their next season, 1933, they went 6-5. But Portsmouth at this point is a really solid winning team with genuine star players, but they are struggling financially too. And they're mostly struggling because they play in Portsmouth, Ohio. This is Portsmouth here. This is the stadium they played in. It's called Universal Stadium. This is the Ohio River in Kentucky, right over here to tell you how far south Portsmouth is in Ohio. Portsmouth is a town of about 42,000 people, roughly, in the early 1930s, which is like having an NFL team in Midland, Michigan. So it's a really small town, which of course limits the audience you can potentially draw to your games. Portsmouth Stadium is actually the first purpose-built NFL stadium in the country. They located a franchise in Portsmouth because the city fathers, if you want to call it that, promised to build them this stadium. And it's actually still there. It's about 2 hours east of 75 if you're headed down that way. But it's really cool and well worth the trip over there if you're interested in this sort of thing. You can really see, you know, the roots of the Lions, the roots of the NFL in this really cool, tangible way. But they're struggling also because they made this decision where they would let people watch their practices for free. And so Dutch Clark, a player on this team, actually said that they would get 3, 4, 5,000 people out to watch their practices for free. But on Sunday, when they charged admission, they'd only get 3 or 4,000 people to actually pay admission and come into their games. And so, of course, during this era, and we saw this with the failed Detroit teams too, your financial well-being is directly related to how many people you can get to come to your game. So if nobody's coming to the games, you can't pay your players and you're out of business. And so by 1933, Portsmouth is pretty much on the sale block. And Portsmouth's money problems in particular are something the league is becoming really worried about by the late 1920s. So this is the NFL map in 1925, and you can kind of see where the franchises were spread out around the northeast quadrant of the country. So you have the Detroit Panthers there, owned, coached, and quarterbacked by the same guy. And well, there's some familiar names on here. You have the New York Giants, the Chicago Bears, Chicago Cardinals, Green Bay Packers. You also have teams in Rock Island, Illinois, or Pottsville, Pennsylvania, Dayton, Ohio. Small market teams. And it's at this point the NFL starts saying they want to reallocate, I guess, start to move around these teams and get them into what they called major league markets, quote unquote. So there's a direct allusion again to Major League Baseball and trying to make the NFL as legitimate as baseball. If you jump ahead just a couple years, 8 years, you can see the map is really solidified in this interesting way, where there's franchises in places that there's still franchises today. You have New York, you have Chicago, Green Bay, and Portsmouth. They're kind of the outliers as far as small towns. The interesting thing about this map too is, well, you have the New York Giants, you also have the Brooklyn Dodgers, the Pittsburgh Pirates, the Cincinnati Reds, all of these football teams that are directly ripping off their baseball counterpart. So again, just tells you again about that borrowed legitimacy and kind of taking any exposure they can get, even if it's confused exposure. So with Portsmouth up on the block for sale, there's only a handful of takers or a handful of prospective buyers that are around. Because of course it can't have an NFL team already. It has to be in kind of this northeastern quadrant of the country because nothing had gone out west yet, nothing had gone down south yet. Out of these options, Detroit was by far the biggest. Detroit had about 1.5 million people by 1933, and there's even a handful of investors within Detroit who wanted to buy a team. But the NFL picks this guy on the left here. His name is George Richards. And he's a really attractive person for the league because he owns WJR, the radio station in Detroit. This picture cracks me up. It always looks like he's surprised, that somebody's talking to him. He's turning and somebody snapped a picture of him. But so it's more about what Detroit can do for the NFL than what the NFL can do for Detroit, if that makes sense. But Richards, for his part, gets this ready-made team, star players. They're right on the edge of winning. And they make the announcement in March of 1934. This is the headline from the Free Press, announcing that the Lions, or the Portsmouth Spartans rather, are moving to Detroit. They're not quite the Lions yet. They have to get to work right away because their season starts in 6 months. So they move the team, or I should say they move half the team. Only 12 of the 24 guys on the roster actually make the move from Portsmouth up to Detroit. And that's because this is essentially a part-time job for these guys in the 1930s. And, football would really remain a part-time job for most of these players until, arguably the 1960s. So only 12 guys make the move up to Detroit. They sign a 2-year lease at University of Detroit Stadium, which you can see here. It's up in the neighborhood of 6 Mile Road in Livernois, kind of in the northwest part of town. Again, a nice, safe pit, 25,000 seat capacity. Meabon Field is up, almost 45,000 by the mid-1930s. So they have a team, they have a place to play, but they still have kind of a ways to go. They don't have a name yet. And they picked their name in July 1934, so 2 months before the season starts. And this is the headline in the Free Press that announces that: "Hold that lion, grid foes to cry." Detroit pros named after jungle beasts. So the Lions, why are they the Detroit Lions and not the Detroit Spartans, the Detroit whatever? So if you ask George Richards, the first owner of the team, he says, quote, the lions are the king, or the lion rather, is the queen. I'll start that over. The lion is the king of the jungle, and the Detroit Lions are going to be the kings of the NFL, quote unquote. That makes perfect sense. That's kind of the official line on why the Lions are named the Lions. Informally, he said, well, it goes pretty well with tigers too. So even he was kind of getting in on that baseball connection. Stick with that jungle cat theme. And the newspaper even calls it out too, named after the jungle beast. They also picked their uniforms in July 1934. This is a colorized photo from a game in 1936. And you can see it's a much, much different blue than the blue we have today. It's much darker. It's almost halfway between a royal and a navy, if you want to call it that. Of course, there's no white anywhere on the uniform, no black, of course, anywhere on the uniform, just blue with silver trim. There's a couple different origin stories as to how these colors were chosen. And they go from kind of team lore to the newspaper to a firsthand account. And I'll take you through all three of them, and you can just pick your favorite. Whichever one you want, that's the one it is, because there's no real consensus on how this happened. So team lore. So according to a media guide, a Lions media guide from 1950, it says, quote, the blue, a distinctive shade, was especially developed for George Richards. Their first owner came up with the color after admiring the hue of the Pacific Ocean on a trip to Hawaii, and the shade was named Honolulu Blue. So there you go. George Richards is inspired by the Pacific Ocean, and it's Honolulu Blue. The second one I have for you is attributed to Cy Houston, who was the team's general manager in the 30s. And he says in the Free Press, Houston selected the uniforms of the Lions last week. And if the boys fail to measure up to colorful expectations as far as their football is concerned, there will still be colorful to look at. Equipment purchased yesterday disclosed that the jerseys will be blue. When asked what kind of blue, Houston said, I don't know. They've had me looking at so many blues, I'm blue in the face. But anyway, it's the kind of blue I'm told that will match with silver, end quote. So he has an opportunity there to say, oh, George Richards, our owner, was inspired by the Pacific Ocean, and it's this great shade named Honolulu Blue. He doesn't do that. Like, I don't know, it's a blue. Somebody picked it. That's what we're going with. The third source comes from this guy on our screen right here, Glenn Presnell. So he started his career in Portsmouth with the Spartans. He was an all-pro tailback in 1933 and likely would have won the league MVP in 1933 had that award existed. It actually didn't exist. But he did an interview in 1999 with Bill Dow, who writes a lot for the Free Press and just is a Detroit sports historian. So we'll hear a bit of that interview here, and Glenn Presnell will tell you how the color came to be.
I was the one that selected those colors, my wife and I. You're kidding me. The day, like I told you, when I went up to the interview for my contract, when he talked me into coming to Detroit, we went out in the next room out there. And he said, I want you to look over these jerseys, the colors here. They had a table with all the different kind of uniform jerseys. Orange.
So there you go, right from the horse's mouth. Presnell, it's interesting that he says too that there was orange and black out on the table, which really makes you think too, maybe they were considering tigers as a name if orange and black was one of the color choices. Presnell also says Honolulu Blue, but I couldn't find any reference to that name for the Lions Blue until 1948 in the Free Press. And when I did find it, it was in reference to a 1941 Buick Special that was for sale in the classified ads. And so at first I didn't know what to make of that. It's like, well, is that like a dog whistle thing? Is it like a Lions fan selling a car specifically to another Lions fan? But in our collection, we have a handful of these original GM exterior color swatches. So I thought, well, maybe that's the actual color of the car. And I went back and looked, and there it is right there. Honolulu Blue, right above Aztec Green Poly and Catalina Gray. It was a color choice you could get for GM vehicles starting in 1942. So it's really funny that like this, the trademark color for this longtime product associated with the Ford family was actually a General Motors creation a little bit early on. But yeah, just interesting story. So George Richards, beyond picking the name, choosing the colors, they also knew that 3 professional teams had failed miserably in Detroit before the Spartans moved to the city in 1934. So that first season, 1934, they really pull out all the stops to make sure this thing is going to work and everybody's going to make money on it. So the first logical thing is that since Richards owns WJR, he does his best to get the games on the radio. That's kind of the no-brainer. He also gives Potsy Clark, their head coach, a weekly show on the radio. He also has a column in the Detroit News. They hold these youth football camps and they have local players try out to see if they can get local guys onto the team to drum up a little interest. They invite these Detroit celebrities to their games, which is like interestingly still a card that teams play today. It's like, oh, celebrities must be, celebrities are there. There must be something interesting going on there. Maybe I should go too. They also tear a page out of the college book in a really significant way, where they, George Richards in particular, buys 2 lion cubs named Grid and Iron and donates them to the Detroit Zoo as the official Lions mascot. They institute a rivalry trophy with the Chicago Bears, so kind of on the order of the Michigan, Minnesota Little Brown Jug. Whoever wins the game or games that year gets to take home this trophy called the Red Grange Trophy, named after the Chicago Bears player from the decade previous. It's this great looking trophy. There's a lion and a bear after this football on top of the world. And it was awarded a couple times in the mid 1930s, 36, 37, and then it goes completely missing in 1938. The paper just stops reporting on it and it disappears out of the historical record. The Hall of Fame doesn't have it. The Bears don't have it. The Lions don't have it. We don't have it. But I'm hopeful that like the more I do this talk, maybe somebody will realize, oh, that's down in my grandma's basement or something. Hoping it'll turn up sooner or later, but interesting story nonetheless. They also, in this period, have a fight song composed, and we're going to hear a little bit of that right now. There you have it. Gridiron Heroes. It's still sung at Ford Field whenever they score a touchdown, kick a field goal. It was written in 1936 by this guy, Graham T. Overgard, who was the director of bands at Wayne State, and he was in charge of the halftime shows for the Lions. So he had this song written, and Overgard's protege, I guess if you want to call it that, moved with the team from Briggs Stadium to the Silverdome. He was still running the halftime show and kept this song kind of in the popular lexicon, if you want to call it that, of Lions games, the experience of going to Lions games. And then by the time they moved from the Silverdome to Ford Field, it was just kind of baked into the experience. A lot of the older NFL teams actually do have fight songs. The Giants have one, the Eagles have one. But it's really this holdover from this time when the pros were imitating college in this really interesting way. Again, it's like, we know that works. Why don't we try to do something that works and that we know works? And so, yeah, Gridiron Heroes, there's the story on that. So in addition to all this flash, they also knew they had an ace up their sleeve. They had some substance as well to go along with it. Ultimately, the Lions caught on because they were really good right out of the gate. So here are your 1934 Detroit Lions. They are coached by George Potsy Clark, who's on the right there. He had made his career coaching in college before he came to the pros. He coached at MSU and at Nebraska, among other places. The 34 Lions are basically the 33 Spartans with one important addition, and that's that guy right in the middle of the screen, Dutch Clark. If we go back a slide, he's right in the middle of the screen right there too, which kind of tells you how important he was to the team. He comes out of retirement in 1934. He had retired for the 1933 season because he could make more money coaching basketball at his alma mater than he could playing professional football, which tells you basically everything you need to know about how much money these guys made. And it's not like he was coaching at Notre Dame or anything either. It was a tiny private school in Colorado named Colorado College. But for the history of Detroit football, it's a good thing he comes back because he's first team All-Pro. He led the league in touchdowns, total yards, and points scored, which was a really important statistic in the 30s, but now has no real relevance because kickers traditionally are the top point scorers in the NFL today. But these 34 Lions had the second best offense in the league and the very best defense in the league that first year. This photo is also interesting. If you're familiar with Midtown Detroit at all, this is the Maccabees building right here that WXYZ used to broadcast out of. The team was on top of this building called the Webster Hall Hotel. That was right at the corner of Cass and Warren, where the Wayne State Bookstore is right now. It's about a block from the museum, coincidentally. But this hotel was kind of was ground zero for the Lions in the 30s. George Richards had an office there. The single players lived at the hotel. The team had their locker room down in the basement of this hotel next to the hotel swimming pool. And so they dress in this locker room in the basement next to the swimming pool, and then they'd go across the street and use a Wayne State field to practice. So it's just really funny to imagine these professional football players dressing at a hotel and then walking down the public sidewalk to get to practice. They would also occasionally practice at Chandler Park on the east side of Detroit. There's this great photo of them practicing at the park. And in the 40s, there's reports in the newspaper about kids like teasing and heckling the Lions while they're practicing because they were really bad in the 40s, like throwing snowballs at him and telling him to get off the field and stuff. It's really kind of funny. But again, just shows you kind of the small roots of this thing that has grown into a multi-billion-dollar industry. So this is that offense I mentioned. So while they were really good, their offense and defense look nothing like modern offenses and defenses. This is an offense called a single wing. And the primary function of this offense is that it's a running offense. They ran out of this about 85% of the time and only passed about 15% of the time. The defining feature of this, if you want to call it that, is that all four of the backs here, quarterback, wingback, fullback, tailback, all four of these guys could receive a direct snap from the center, and all four of them could either be a runner, a passer, a receiver, or a kicker on any play. And so there's this real distinction between the backs and the line, but that's kind of the only distinction. There's no real positional specialization beyond that, even though everybody kind of played their role. So Dutch Clark, the guy we've been talking about a little bit, he's the tailback. The tailback is by far the most important player in a single wing. He's the jack of all trades. So he will run, he will pass, he will kick. The offense runs through him most of the time. And Clark had the most rushing yards. He had the most extra points, the most field goals, the second most passes, and the third most receptions. So again, he does everything. The fullback in this offense is the primary running option. So more often than not, if they're just going to run the ball, the fullback does the running. The quarterback in this offense is the least important back, obviously. So our quarterback here is this guy named Roy Lumpkin. They also called him Pop Lumpkin or Father Lumpkin because he was 35 and the other guys on the team were like 27. So he's the old guy. So he's Pop. But he is a really interesting character kind of in and of himself. The quarterback is basically the blocking back. He only had 6 rushing attempts the entire season in 1934. So it's kind of the analog would be, I guess, the modern fullback, or fullback in an I formation, something like that. But he was always running afoul of management because he was a professional wrestler in the off season, and they were really worried that he was going to get hurt in the off season for good reason. He was also one of the last guys in the league to wear a helmet, which is pretty interesting. The wingback is the fastest guy on this team in particular, number 1, Ernie Cadell. And he's out of the backs anyway, is the primary receiver, if you want to call it that. Both the ends, the left end and the right end also were receiving target. But gives you an idea of how this offense ranked. They also, don't forget, had Glenn Presnell, who was first team All-Pro in 1933, and then was relegated to the bench in 1934 when Clark came back, which kind of tells you how good Clark was, where Presnell would have been the primary option on any other team in the league. He's a second stringer on the line. If you turn it around and look at their defense, they played 6 guys across the line. The norm for this era was to play 7 across the line. And so Clark says in his biography, which is a fascinating book and gets into all this stuff in much greater detail, that used to give teams fits. Just having 1 fewer guy on the line of scrimmage was enough to mess people up. And if the names on the defensive side look pretty familiar, that's for good reason. These guys played offense, they played defense, they also played special teams. And that is really a product of the roster size in this era, but also the substitution rules. So if you look at these 1934 Lions, here they are at Cranbrook Academy, where they're having their summer training. Good luck picking out the offensive backs, the receiving targets, or the linemen even out of this lineup. And you kind of can, if you look, there's some beefier guys in there. But because the rosters were limited to 22 players, all the guys had to play offense. They all had to play defense. They all had to play special teams. Also, the subbing rules were much, much different. In this era, if you came out, say you got injured in the second quarter, you couldn't go back in until the start of the third quarter. If you got injured in the third or wanted a drink of water in the third, you couldn't go back in until the start of the fourth. And so even that was an improvement on how it used to be in the 20s, which was like baseball. If you came out of the game at all, you couldn't go back in. So the NFL didn't take on unlimited free substitution, what they called, until the late 1940s. I believe it was 1948, before you could sub in and out as many times as you wanted. And as the roster size gradually started to grow, and you couple it with that unlimited free substitution, that's how you get 300-pound offensive linemen or defensive linemen who come into the game for 1 play and then go back out. You have players in the NFL today who just play on 3rd down on the defensive side of the ball, and that was completely foreign to the 1930s. So as these positional responsibilities really narrow, you start to get these body types that typify those positional responsibilities, which is how you get, Panay Sewell, who's 6'8", 330 pounds, but can run a 40-yard dash in, 5-6 seconds. It's pretty incredible. These guys just had to be all generally athletic. And going back to what I was talking about before, like picking out the linemen from the receivers, the average weight along the Lions offensive line in 1934 was 214 pounds. And the average weight among the backs was 197 pounds. So there's really no difference. They're just kind of generally athletic. Maybe if you're a little bigger, you're a lineman, but you still had to play on the punt coverage team or on the kick coverage team, whatever the situation called for. Not just because they were tough, which is kind of the narrative you hear a lot. So back to this 1934 season. I love this photo because this is Dutch Clark, number 7. And this is the discus thrower, kind of the classical ideal of athleticism. And then there's the modern, by 1930 standards, ideal of athleticism standing right next to them. But they start the season on a real roll. They win their first 10 games in a row, and they shut out their first 7 opponents. And after these first 10 games, they had outscored the other team 215 to 27 They don't lose their first game until week 11, unfortunately, against the Packers. But that sets up what was called the Football Classic of the 1934 NFL season. It's the showdown between the Lions, who were 10-1, and the Chicago Bears, who are 11-0 on Thanksgiving Day. And the Free Press says this about the game, quote, "The largest crowd which ever witnessed a football game in Detroit is expected to attend. It will be a battle for the championship of the Western Division of the league," end quote. So George Richards knew that Thanksgiving Day games were kind of a risky proposition. If the weather was good, people would come out, but if the weather was crummy, everybody would stay home. They had stuff to do later in the day. This isn't the first Thanksgiving Day game in Detroit or in the NFL or really anywhere. Football on Thanksgiving was a long established tradition. University of Detroit had been playing on Thanksgiving. Local high schools played on Thanksgiving in this era. Even the Detroit Wolverines had played a game on Thanksgiving. But this was the Lions' first Thanksgiving Day game. And even other NFL teams had played before on Thanksgiving. So they didn't invent it, but they kind of perfected it. This game, for once, lived up to the hype. It was broadcast on 94 different radio stations across the country. It's the first nationally broadcast NFL game in history. And for once, really, the game lived up to the hype. The Lions were up 16-13 until late in the fourth quarter when the Bears scored. The Lions got the ball back, down 19-16 now, and drove the field, stalled out at about the 40-yard line, and time expired. This is a photo of that first Thanksgiving Day game from our collection. Interesting thing about this is that it says attendance was 26,000, even though the stadium could only hold about 25,000. So they packed them in all over the place. You can see kind of some overflow seating back here behind the end zone. And they said 20,000 people were turned away, which is almost an entire stadium's worth of people was turned away. I might take that number with a little bit of salt, but they probably turned away thousands of people. These are some game level or field level, I should say, action shots of that game. Here you got Ace Gutowski faking a hit. You can see about, what is that, 19 of the 22 guys on the field in that pile right there. The game was so good and so exciting, and everybody had such a good time that they scheduled another one for 1935 and another one for 36. And here we are 90 some years running, still having Thanksgiving Day games in Detroit. And that's mostly because this 34 game is so good. And even though it was a loss, the Detroit Times, a defunct newspaper in the city, said this about the game. They say, quote, "The Lions collected not only their customers' money, but also won over their wholehearted loyalty. Until the Lions put up their game stand against the Bears, professional football was still just a new enterprise, which had most of Detroit's best wishes, but little else. In their last home game, the Lions won them over. They became Detroit's own team, just as the Tigers and Red Wings are Detroit's own," end quote. So this game not only established that Thanksgiving Day tradition, but the silver lining of that loss was that, they had kind of arrived. This was the point where the Lions joined the Tigers and Red Wings in the Detroit sports pantheon. There's an interesting story, too, that Glenn Presnell tells in that oral history. That snippet of the interview I played is just a couple seconds. It's a much longer interview, but he says that George Richards actually had a bear brought down from northern Michigan. He owned some property in northern Michigan and brought down a bear. And if they beat the Bears, they were going to have bear meat for their Thanksgiving Day dinner at the Webster Hall Hotel. And he doesn't elaborate whether they had the bear or did not have the bear after losing the game. But I don't know. I've never heard what bear meat tastes like. I can't imagine it's that good. The Bears go on to lose to the New York Giants in the NFL championship that year. So there's no video of the film, I should say, of the 34 Thanksgiving Day game, but we do have some footage of the 36 game that I'll play you here. It just kind of shows you how that single wing offense ran. You can see it live and see it at kind of game speed. Again, it's cut pretty quickly, and it's over cranked a little bit, so it looks like people are running around faster than they actually were. But I'll kind of narrate here as we go, so we can see what's going on. So it's going to come in kind of mid-play. You're going to see Dutch Clark kind of going off tackle, number 7 here. There's no sound. So there's Clark. The next play is going to be Gutowski, number 5, on this off tackle play. So Gutowski goes out, and number 9, Bill Shepard, comes in. So Gutowski, of course, won't be able to come back in until the start of the next quarter. They keep faking this end around, and that's going to pay off in just a second. They're setting it up, setting it up, setting it up, going off tackle. See it there. Next, we're going to get a Dutch Clark pass here. Fake that off tackle. A little wobbler, but does the trick. Here we get that reverse again. We'll see Clark one more time. You see the guy without the helmet there. Yeah, yeah. And then a Dutch Clark drop kick. There, a failed drop kick. But there you have it. So a neat thing about this too is you see the 2 pair of field goal posts here. And at this point, college had theirs at the back of the end zone and the pros had theirs at the front of the end zone. So venues that had a college team and a pro team would just have 2 sets of field goal posts on their field most of the time. So the next year, even though 34 was ultimately a disappointment, didn't really pay off the way people thought it was going to. 1935, they come back, they return most of the team, and they have a worse record. They go 7-3-2, so they're worse off than the 11-2 they finish in 1934. But they win their division, even though they're statistically inferior to that 34 team, and they beat the New York Giants 26-7 in the NFL championship game. So 1935 is the Lions' first NFL championship. So they win it in December 1935. And the interesting thing is that the Tigers won their first World Series in October 1935. Then the Lions win in December 1935. And then in April of 1936, the Red Wings win their first Stanley Cup. So within 6 months, all 3 teams won their championships. And it's the first time that had ever been done. And it's the last time it's ever been done too. Other cities have come close. Boston's come close a couple times. But that remains a record that Detroit holds. But the important thing for our story is that this championship really pays off all of that excitement from 1934. You can see a scenario, especially with what's coming next, where all the excitement about this team just kind of fizzles away because nothing really comes of it. This championship really kind of cements that legacy. If you have to draw a line, 1938 is kind of the last year for this era. Clark retires after this year. The core group of players that were around in the mid-30s are all gone by 1938. And then the team itself moves from U of D Stadium to Briggs Stadium. They kept turning thousands of people away, and obviously that's good for your finances. And so Briggs Stadium in 1938 had completely renovated, completely enclosed the stadium and double-decked it, transitioned from Meabon Field to Briggs Stadium and over the offseason of 37-38. And they move in and kind of, now they're sharing Briggs Stadium with the Tigers. So they've really arrived in this really significant way. Or had they? So the 1940s, as good as the 30s were, the 1940s were conversely as bad. It's really this decade of futility. They go 35, 71, and 4 over the course of the decade, which is a 35% winning percentage. They lose every game in 1942. They win 1 game in 1946 and 2 games in 1948. So it's no surprise that their owner sells the team in 1948 to the 7-man group that includes Edwin Anderson, who's the primary figure. He's also the president of Global Beer in Detroit. So he's all over the place in the 40s and 50s. But the team was losing money. They were losing about $200,000 a year. So heading into the 1950 season, Edwin Anderson comes out and he says, "No profit, no Lions" is the headline in the Free Press. They weren't drawing very well. They had dropped down to about 15,000 people annually. And in a stadium of 52,000 people, that looks really bad. It looks more empty than it actually is. And you can see some evidence of that in the photo on the screen now. Here, in this article from the Free Press, Anderson says, quote, If Detroit fans do not support the type of team and the kind of football we will get them in 1950, then we are through, end quote. So the team was either going to disband or be sold, which is really interesting. Thankfully, things turned around pretty quickly. So ahead of that 1950 season, they picked up Bobby Lane, the quarterback from the New York Bulldogs. In the same draft, ahead of the 1950 season, they picked up the 1949 Heisman Trophy winner, Doak Walker, who's on the screen there from SMU. And they also picked up the 1950 Heisman Trophy winner, two Heisman Trophy winners in the same draft, Leon Hart out of Notre Dame. And interestingly, Hart never lost a game in college football. He won 4 straight national championships at Notre Dame. And he was kind of the consensus #1 pick. Everybody in the league wanted Leon Hart, and the Lions got him. So maybe it's no surprise. By 1951, they're back to being competitive. In 1952, they start to reel off one of the best, stretches in NFL history. They win the championship in 52, 53, get back to the championship game in 54 before losing. They have an off year in 55. 56, they lose out on going to the championship game on the last Sunday of the season. Had they won that game, they would have been back in the championship game. And by 57, they round back into championship form, and they're winners once again. So the Lions are really the dominant team again in the 1950s. They are America's team, more or less. They're on TV all the time. And it's during the 50s that TV and football really get into a marriage in a really interesting way. Professional football arguably is better on TV than it is in person. I know it's fun to go to games, but you don't have nearly the amount of information you get watching it on TV. Of course, your own bathroom, that sort of thing. But also football is just kind of made for TV. It, goes left to right across your screen in this really logical order. There's natural breaks in the action for commercials and that sort of thing. So the Lions are this really dominant team at a time when TV's coming into the picture. And so their players become household names. Doak Walker is advertising things for companies left and right. Bobby Lane becomes the first professional football player on the cover of Time magazine. You can see him there in 1954. Lane is important because he becomes, he's, I guess, a star player on a marquee team of the era, in this era when the league is really pushing passing in a significant way too. This photo that's on the right out of the Reuther Library at Wayne State, you can see he's holding a white football right here. And at first I thought that was just like a Walmart special football, that you'd pick up and just throw around. But the league had actually changed the ball to their official ball was white in the mid-1950s because it showed up better on television. You could see it better on a black and white screen. So the Lions have a marquee quarterback at the time that the league is really interested in pushing passing. And even though Lane is one of the most proficient passers, they're still running the ball 60% of the time. So it's a 60-40 run-pass split, even in this era where passing is being promoted really heavily. The 50s are also the beginning of the modern game from the sense that it wasn't until 1954 that the all 12 teams in the league made a profit. They finished the year in the black. It's pretty interesting to think before that there were still teams finishing in the red up to that point, and now it's an $18 billion a year business. So this decade of dominance really cements the Lions kind of forever after. So what happened? So the next 65 years, aren't nearly as good. It's not as much fun to be a Lions fan. So you can see here winning percentage by decade. The 2000s, so your Joey Harrington, Marty Morningweg, Steve Mariucci years in there are the worst historically for the team. I haven't done this decade's total yet. We'll wait and see how that plays out. But if you average things out over 90 years, you get some pretty interesting results. So they've played just over 1,300 games. They've won 592 and they've lost 708. And that's good for a 45% winning percentage. So that isn't great, but it's not the worst. It's 25th, in fact, across the league. So before the 2023 season, they averaged 10-win season every 8 years. They won the division about every 11 years, and they make the playoffs about every 5 years. But these statistics are kind of skewed by the 1950s because they count championship games as playoff. But headed into the 2023 season, of course, they had this famous 30-year drought of playoff appearance or playoff wins, rather. It's at this point in the presentation, I always brought up this graphic here. And apologies for the quality of this photo. I took it from my couch, and that's my TV there. So this is Hard Knocks. If you watched the Lions on HBO a couple of summers ago, over the before the 2022 season, I believe. If you looked around in the Lions team meeting room where they'd get together, before they'd go out to practice or split up into positional groups, this banner was on the wall in their practice facility. It says 1992 last playoff win, 1993 last division championship, 1957 last league championship. And this is always where if you come to a Lions presentation, you almost have to expect to hear this stuff I'm going to tell you next. So it's all the sad stuff over the last 65 years or so. So Detroit and Cleveland, of course, the only teams that existed before the Super Bowl that have yet to appear in the Super Bowl. They finished the 2008 season 0-16, the first time that had ever been done in a 16-game season. Before 2023, they had one playoff win in 1991, one playoff win in the entire existence of the franchise. George Wilson, this is one that you don't hear that often, but I think it might be the most interesting. So George Wilson, who is the coach of the Lions in the 1960s, quit in 1964. He took a couple years off, and then he became the very first head coach of the Miami Dolphins in 1966. But George Wilson is the last Lions head coach to leave the Lions and become the head coach of another NFL team. No one else has done that since the 1960s. Of course, little did we know, in 2021, it was really the start of something new. There was a shakeup. And for a lot of fans, I know it certainly did for me. It felt like one more shakeup in a long line of shakeups that was never really going to result in anything. But in January 2021, the Lions hired this guy on our screen now, Brad Holmes, who is the former director of college scouting for the LA Rams. 1 week later, they hire this guy, Dan Campbell. And I'll play you a snippet from his introductory press conference. There's some kind of cheesy, dramatic music behind it, but it's a lot of fun to listen to. So we'll take a listen to Dan Campbell's first day on the job.
Just as an overall philosophy, you're going to say, well, what's this team going to be? What's it not going to be? I know that Detroit's made up of great people. This community is strong. This place has been kicked. It's been battered. It's been bruised. And I can sit up here and give you coach speak all day long. I can give you, hey, we're going to win this many games. I can't. None of that matters, and you guys don't want to hear it anyway. You've had enough of that. So excuse my language. This city's been down, and it found a way to get up. All right, it's found a way to overcome adversity. We're going to kick you in the teeth. And when you punch us back, we're going to smile at you. And when you knock us down, we're going to get up. And on the way up, we're going to bite a kneecap off, and we're going to stand up. And then it's going to take 2 more shots to knock us down. And on the way up, we're going to take your other kneecap, and we're going to get up. And then it's going to take 3 shots to get us down. And when we do, we're going to take another hunk out of you. Before long, we're going to be the last one standing. All right. That's going to be the mentality. All right. We're going to be competitive every game. I can't sit up here and guarantee wins and losses, but I'll guarantee you this, man, these guys are going to fight, and they're going to scratch and claw, and they're going to be something this city's proud of because they're going to take on the identity of this city.
So there you go. That was exciting, but then this new regime's kind of first order of business was to trade the 11-year starting quarterback, Matthew Stafford, to the Los Angeles Rams for draft capital. And sitting where we are now, kind of on the heels of the last 2 seasons, it's easy to forget that it really didn't start out that great. 2021, the team finishes 3-13-1, and it really kind of felt the same after that season. But ahead of that year, they picked up Penei Sewell and Amon-Ra St. Brown in the draft. The next year, they get Jameson Williams, Aiden Hutchinson, Kirby Joseph, all in the draft. They finished the year 9-8, but they finished the year ultimately out of the playoffs, but win that last game of the year in Green Bay, a place where the Lions never won. They had, of course, had a chance to make the playoffs. Had Seattle lost earlier in the day. Seattle won. The Lions suddenly have nothing to play for. Packers have everything to play for. All they have to do is win the game. They're in the playoffs, and the Lions went out and beat them anyway. It's just really this paradigm shifting game at Lambeau Field at the end of the season. They finished the year 9-8, but well, there's no real moral victories in sports. That sure felt like a moral victory. Ahead of the 2023 season, we get Jahmyr Gibbs and Sam Laporta, and those are both with picks that the Lions realized from that Matthew Stafford trade. So heading into the 2023 season, there's actually only 2 players still on the roster from the pre-Dan Campbell, Brad Holmes era, Frank Ragnow and Taylor Decker, both on the offensive line. We all know how the 2023 season ends. Not only do the Lions go 12-5, they win the NFC North, so they cross that one off their list. They win not 1 but 2 playoff games for the first time in team history, and of course fall 1 game short of the Super Bowl. So we're not able to cross that last one off yet. But 2024 really brought more of the same. The Lions are the Sports Illustrated Super Bowl preseason favorite. They set a franchise record 15 wins, first ever #1 seed in the playoffs. At one point over the course of the season, they were 10-1, which was the best record they had had since their first year in 1934, going into that game with the Bears on Thanksgiving Day, 10-1. They even announced it on one of the broadcasts. I was like, yes, that's in my presentation. And while this season, came to an untimely end a couple weeks ago, I'll leave you with a ray of sunshine here. So from a historical perspective, this past season was really remarkably similar to that 1934 season. The offense is super powered. They're scoring like crazy, blowing people off the field. They set franchise record for wins, and then it's ultimately disappointing. So with that, 1935, as we remember, was better. The team was a little bit worse, but the end result was a little better. So maybe 90 years in the making here, kind of to the year, we'll have history repeating itself. But either way, it's a really good time to be a Lions fan. Once again, we're kind of sitting in the middle of this new golden age, 65 years in the making, which is pretty exciting. But with that, we've come to the end. I certainly appreciate all of your attention, and thanks for coming out again. No, sure thing. I'm happy to answer questions if everybody has them, or just be quiet as the situation dictates. All right. Oh man, it's hard to beat 91 and Barry Sanders. I was impressionable age at that, but man, it's tough to top this year, right? I mean, Montgomery and Gibbs and that offense is just so dynamic. It's hard to say. There's a lot in between that is kind of forgettable too. So that's fun. But yes, yeah. Yeah, that's right. And he retired there, and he lived his life out there, from what I've read. Is that right? My goodness. Yeah, fascinating guy. And yeah, there's a much longer interview that I've been trying to get Bill to, I don't know, start a podcast or something. He interviewed all of these old Lions right around the turn of the 21st century, I guess. And it's just, those guys aren't around anymore. Kind of gold. If you're interested in this era of history. Is that right? Oh my gosh. Yeah, that area. I mean, that's a presentation all to itself, but that's kind of the cradle of, football, professional football, certainly there. The NFL and that American Professional Football League grew out of this merger of the Ohio, it was like the Ohio Valley Professional League and the Pennsylvania Professional League, and then they kind of came together, and that was the roots. But yeah, you saw on that one slide in the 1925 map, the kind of concentration of teams in South Central Ohio. Yeah, Ironton, Portsmouth, and Canton, and Dayton, all of those teams. Yeah, that's where it really got started, which is why the Hall of Fame's there. Oh yeah, my pleasure. Thank you again. Have a nice night.